On the 13th of December 1931, a 57-year-old man stepped off the curb on Fifth Avenue in New York City. He looked left. This was the British way. In America, traffic comes from the right. The car struck him at over 30 miles per hour. The impact threw his body 15 feet across the pavement. Witnesses heard the sickening crack of ribs breaking. Blood began pooling beneath his head on the cold Manhattan concrete. A crowd gathered quickly, as crowds do when disaster strikes in public. Someone recognized the crumpled figure lying motionless in the street. It was Winston Churchill, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, out-of-power politician, a man whose name in that moment meant little to most Americans. They could not know that this broken body contained the mind that would one day hold the fate of Western civilization in its hands. He remained unconscious for hours. The doctors at Lenox Hill Hospital counted his injuries: cracked ribs, severe head trauma, deep lacerations, internal bleeding. For 8 days he lay in that hospital bed, hovering between recovery and something worse. When he finally woke, his first act was to insist, loudly and repeatedly, that the accident was entirely his own fault. His second act was to demand that someone find the driver and give him money. The poor man must be terrified, Churchill reasoned. He might lose his job. This could not be allowed. This was the essential contradiction of Winston Churchill: reckless enough to walk into traffic without looking, generous enough to worry about the man who nearly killed him, stubborn enough to argue with doctors while barely conscious, and somehow, against all odds, indestructible. But survival was never the same as peace. To understand how Winston Churchill saved the world, we must first understand what nearly destroyed him. And that story begins not on a New York street in 1931, but 67 years earlier, in the grand corridors of an English palace, with a scandal that would shape everything he became. The tale starts with betrayal. It always does with the Churchills. In 1876, Lord Randolph Churchill committed an act so reckless that it nearly brought down the British monarchy. It had nothing to do with politics. It had everything to do with letters, blackmail, and the future King of England. The scandal began with adultery, not Lord Randolph's own but his brother's. Lord Blandford, the elder Churchill's son, had been conducting an affair with Lady Aylesford. When Lady Aylesford's husband discovered the betrayal and threatened divorce, the resulting publicity would have destroyed multiple aristocratic families. Worse still, the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, had written compromising letters to Lady Aylesford himself, letters that could embarrass the crown. Lord Randolph obtained these letters. Then he did something unforgivable. Picture the scene: a private room in a London club, gaslight flickering on mahogany walls. Lord Randolph sits across from the prince's personal secretary. Between them, on the polished table, lie the letters, the Prince of Wales's own handwriting, his own indiscretions, his own vulnerability laid bare. "Tell His Royal Highness," Lord Randolph said, his voice steady, "that if this divorce proceeds, every newspaper in London will print what he wrote to Lady Aylesford." It was blackmail, it was madness, and it would cost his family everything. The Prince of Wales was not a man who forgave easily. He declared publicly that he would never again enter any house that received Lord Randolph Churchill. In the rigid social hierarchy of Victorian England, this was a death sentence. The Churchills were cast out, ostracized, exiled from the society that had defined their existence. Lord Randolph was sent to Ireland as his father's private secretary, a face-saving banishment that fooled no one. His American wife, the beautiful Jenny Jerome, went with him, and so did their infant son, born just 2 years earlier in circumstances almost as dramatic as the scandal that followed. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill entered the world on the 30th of November, 1874, at Blenheim Palace. He arrived 2 months premature during a ball. His mother, Jenny, had been dancing when the labor pains began. There was no time to reach the prepared bedroom upstairs. The baby was delivered in a ground-floor room, amid chaos and candlelight. He came into the world in a hurry. He would live his entire life the same way. Jenny Jerome was not like other aristocratic mothers of her era. She was American, a dollar princess. The newspapers called her one of the wealthy American heiresses who crossed the Atlantic to trade their father's fortunes for British titles. Her father, Leonard Jerome, had made millions on Wall Street. Her mother's family claimed descent from Iroquois warriors, though this was likely romantic invention. What was not invented was Jenny's extraordinary beauty. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, with a figure that drew stares in every ballroom, she was considered one of the most stunning women in England. She was also considered one of the most scandalous. The affairs began early in her marriage and never really stopped. The Prince of Wales himself was rumored to be among her lovers, the same prince her husband had tried to blackmail. Count Karl Kinski, an Austrian diplomat, was another. The list grew over the years. Jenny made little effort to hide her indiscretions, and Lord Randolph made little effort to stop them. Some whispered that Winston might not be Lord Randolph's son at all. The timing of Jenny's pregnancy, her known intimacy with other men, the physical differences between father and son, all of it fed the gossip. But gossip is not evidence. What we know for certain is simpler and sadder. Whoever his biological father was, Winston Churchill grew up feeling like an orphan in his own home. Lord Randolph had no time for his son. He was consumed by politics, by ambition, by the urgent need to restore his reputation after the blackmail disaster. When he looked at Winston, he saw disappointment. The boy struggled at school. His letters were full of spelling errors. His reports were mediocre at best. Lord Randolph made his feelings brutally clear. "You will become a mere social wastrel," he told Winston after reviewing one particularly poor school report, one of the hundreds of public school failures. These words burned themselves into Winston's memory. He would spend the rest of his life trying to prove his dead father wrong. Jenny was no more present than her husband, though her absence was different in character. She was not cold. When she appeared, she dazzled her son with her beauty, her wit, her glamour. But she rarely appeared. Winston saw his mother perhaps twice a year during his childhood. His letters to her survive, and they are heartbreaking in their urgency. "Please do come down to see me," he wrote from boarding school, the repeated word a child's frantic attempt to make his plea impossible to ignore. She did not come. The person who did come, who was always there, was Elizabeth Ann Everest, Mrs. Everest, his nanny. Winston called her womb or woomany, baby talk that he never outgrew. She was the one who comforted him when he was sick. She was the one who listened to his fears. She was the one who told him he was special, that he would do great things, that he was loved. When Mrs. Everest died in 1895, Winston rushed to her bedside. He paid for her funeral. He kept her photograph in his room for the rest of his life. In his memoirs, written decades later, he called her my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years I had lived. His mother received a different assessment. Years later, he would describe her in his memoirs with painful honesty. "She shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance." Lord Randolph's end came in 1895 as well, the same year as Mrs. Everest's death. But his dying was slower, more terrible, and shrouded in mystery that persists to this day. The official cause of death was listed as general paralysis. But everyone knew this was a euphemism. The symptoms Lord Randolph displayed in his final years, the slurred speech, the erratic behavior, the violent mood swings, the progressive mental deterioration, pointed to something else, something shameful, something the family was determined to hide. Many historians believe Lord Randolph died of syphilis, contracted years earlier and left untreated until it destroyed his brain. Others argue for a brain tumor or some other neurological condition that mimicked those terrible symptoms. The truth is that we do not know. The medical records were sealed. The family closed ranks. Whatever killed Lord Randolph Churchill, They ensured the world would never learn the full details. Winston was 20 years old when his father died. He had barely known the man. They had never had a real conversation, never shared a confidence, never bridged the vast distance between them. And now they never would. But the dead have power over the living. Lord Randolph's ghost would haunt Winston for decades. The son idealized the father he had never known, writing a massive biography that painted Lord Randolph as a misunderstood genius. He entered politics to continue his father's work. He sought the same offices, fought the same battles, carried the same name into the same arenas. And always beneath it all was the fear that his father had been right, that he was destined to be a failure, that the shadow which had consumed Lord Randolph, whatever its true nature, might be waiting for him too. The boy his father dismissed would spend his life proving the dead man wrong. He would start by riding into battle with a death wish disguised as courage. At 21 years old, Winston Churchill rode into combat armed with a Mauser pistol and an unshakable conviction that he could not be killed. He was half right. The bullets missed him, but the wounds he sought, the wounds to his reputation, to his conscience, to his soul, those found their mark. His military career was a calculated exercise in self-promotion. He understood, even as a young man, that fame was currency. Wars were where fame was made, so he went to wars, as many as he could find. Cuba came first in 1895. He was not yet a soldier but a journalist, observing Spanish forces fighting Cuban rebels. He came under fire on his 21st birthday. He discovered that he rather enjoyed it. India followed, then Sudan. In 1898, he participated in one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history at the Battle of Omdurman. Thousands of Sudanese warriors fell before British guns. Winston rode among them, firing his pistol, killing at close range. He wrote about it afterward with disturbing enthusiasm. He spoke of killing 3 men personally, savages, he called them, using the language of his time and class without apparent discomfort. The young officer saw glory where others might have seen slaughter. He saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. His critics noticed. They called him a medal hunter and a self-advertiser. They accused him of using war as a stepping stone to political power. They were not entirely wrong. The Boer War made him famous. In 1899, he traveled to South Africa as a war correspondent. Within weeks, he was captured by Boer forces after the armored train he was riding was ambushed. He was taken to a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria. What happened next became legend. Churchill escaped. He climbed over a wall, walked through the enemy capital in the darkness of night, jumped a freight train, hid in a coal mine, and eventually made his way to Portuguese territory and freedom. The story made headlines around the world. He returned to Britain a hero. But there were whispers. Some said he had broken his parole, that he had given his word not to escape and then violated it. Others pointed out that 2 other officers had planned the escape with him, only to be left behind when Churchill went over the wall alone. The truth, as always with Churchill, was complicated. He had given a qualified parole that he later argued did not bind him. He had intended to bring the others, but circumstances prevented it. What mattered was the result. He was famous now. He could begin his real career. Politics came quickly. He won a seat in Parliament in 1900 at the age of 25. He was a conservative like his father, but not for long. In 1904, Winston Churchill crossed the floor of the House of Commons and joined the Liberal Party. In British politics, this was an act of betrayal almost without parallel. Party loyalty was sacred. To abandon one's party was to abandon one's tribe, one's friends, one's entire political identity. They called him the Blenheim Rat. The Conservatives never forgave him. Many never would. He rose quickly in Liberal ranks. By 1910, he was Home Secretary, one of the most powerful positions in government. and almost immediately he found himself at the center of controversy. The Tonypandy riots erupted in Wales that year. Coal miners striking for better wages clashed with police. Rumors spread that Churchill had ordered soldiers to fire on the workers. The rumors were false. He had actually held the troops back, sending police instead, but the legend persisted. In Wales, his name became synonymous with oppression. Decades later, miners' families still cursed Winston Churchill for a massacre that never happened. The following year brought the Sydney Street siege. Anarchists had barricaded themselves in a London building. Police surrounded them. And then, inexplicably, the Home Secretary himself showed up. Churchill stood in the street, top hat clearly visible, watching the gunfight unfold. Photographers captured the scene. Critics were outraged. What was a cabinet minister doing at a police operation? Was he directing the siege? Was he grandstanding for the cameras? He was, of course, doing both. He could not resist being where the action was. He could not resist being seen. That same year, 1911, he made a decision that would look very different a century later. As Home Secretary, he banned interracial boxing matches in Britain. His reasoning was explicit. He did not want white boxers to be seen losing to black fighters in public. The racial hierarchy must be maintained, even in sport. This was not unusual for his time, but it was not universal either. Many of his contemporaries found such views extreme. The attitudes that would later lead him to dismiss Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion were already forming. The man who would save Western civilization from fascism held views that, on questions of race, were not so distant from the fascists themselves. But that reckoning lay decades in the future. In 1911, Winston Churchill was a rising star, a man of action, a politician of extraordinary gifts and troubling blind spots. He had made himself famous. Now he needed to make himself loved. He found her at a dinner party, or rather, he found her again. They had met once before in 1904 at a ball. Winston had seen Clementine Hozier across the room and been struck speechless, literally speechless. He could not bring himself to approach her. He stood frozen, watching her dance with other men, unable to move or speak. Eventually, the evening ended. She left. He had not said a single word to her. 4 years later, fate offered a second chance. They were seated next to each other at a dinner hosted by her great aunt. This time, he found his voice. Clementine was not conventionally beautiful in the way Jenny had been. She was striking rather than stunning, with sharp features and intelligent eyes. She was also poor, or at least poor by the standards of the aristocracy. Her family had money troubles. Her mother had a reputation that rivaled Jenny's for scandal. And there was a secret at the heart of her identity. Clementine's mother, Lady Blanche Hozier, had conducted numerous affairs throughout her marriage. The question of who had actually fathered Clementine was never definitively answered. Sir Henry Hozier, her legal father, was one possibility. Bertie Mitford, one of her mother's lovers, was another. Clementine grew up with the same uncertainty about her parentage that gossips attributed to Winston. Perhaps this shared wound drew them together. Perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps two damaged people recognized something in each other that promised healing. The courtship was swift. They met again in March of 1908. By August he had proposed. She accepted. On the 12th of September they were married at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster. Clementine had doubts. She nearly broke off the engagement in the weeks before the wedding. Something about Winston's intensity frightened her. His neediness, his obsessive focus, his inability to think about anything except his own ambitions. She sensed correctly that marriage to this man would mean subordinating her entire existence to his. She married him anyway. She would spend the next 57 years managing the consequences of that decision. The marriage was not unhappy, but it was not easy either. Winston's emotional demands were relentless. He needed constant reassurance, constant attention, constant praise. When Clementine could not provide these things, when she needed space, when she needed rest, when she needed to be something other than Winston's support system. He became petulant, wounded, impossible. She developed what the era called nervous exhaustion. Today we might call it depression or anxiety or simply the rational response to an irrational situation. She took extended rest cures at spas and sanatoriums, sometimes for weeks at a time. She needed to escape. He could not understand why. The money was a constant source of tension. Winston earned substantial sums from his riding and his political positions. He spent more than he earned, always, without exception. Champagne, cigars, books, paintings, and then in 1922 Chartwell. He bought the estate in Kent without telling her. She learned of the purchase after it was already done. The house was a wreck, requiring endless renovations. The grounds were beautiful but expensive to maintain. Clementine hated it from the first moment she saw it. She would hate it for the rest of her life. But Winston loved Chartwell with a passion he rarely showed for anything except politics and war. It became his refuge, his creative space, his kingdom. He painted there. He wrote there. He built walls and dug ponds and raised butterflies. Chartwell was where he went to escape the shadow that pursued him. Clementine understood this. She accepted it. She managed the household, juggled the creditors, maintained the facade of stability while her husband spent money they did not have on luxuries they did not need. This was her role. This was her sacrifice. They would have 5 children together. Diana came first in 1909, then Randolph in 1911, Sarah in 1914, Marigold in 1918, and finally Mary in 1922. The price those children would pay for their father's greatness was still decades away. For now, there was hope. There was love, genuine if complicated. There was the sense that Winston Churchill was destined for something extraordinary, and that Clementine would be beside him when he achieved it. She could not know what that achievement would cost. She could not know that the path to glory led first through catastrophe, through beaches soaked with blood, through tens of thousands dead, through a failure so complete that it would haunt her husband for the rest of his days. The Dardanelles were calling, and Winston Churchill, as always, could not resist the sound of guns. In the spring of 1915, Winston Churchill convinced the War Cabinet that he could end the Great War in a matter of weeks. His plan was bold, imaginative, and utterly characteristic of the man who conceived it. He would bypass the bloody stalemate of the Western Front entirely. He would strike at the soft underbelly of the enemy alliance. He would knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, open a supply route to Russia, and change the course of events forever. By summer, the beaches of Gallipoli were soaked with the blood of an empire, and Winston Churchill's career lay in ruins. The Dardanelles campaign began as a naval operation. British and French warships would force their way through the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, sail into the Sea of Marmara, and threaten Constantinople itself. The Ottoman government would collapse. The war would be shortened by years. Millions of lives would be saved. That was the theory. The reality was different. On the 18th of March, 1915, the Allied fleet attacked the Dardanelles defenses. Within hours, 3 battleships had been sunk by mines. 3 more were crippled. The naval commander, Admiral de Robeck, lost his nerve. He refused to continue the assault. Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, urged him to press on. The Turkish defenses were nearly exhausted, he argued. One more push would break them. But de Robeck would not be moved. The naval attack was abandoned. What followed was worse. Instead of accepting defeat, the War Cabinet decided to land troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula. They would seize the heights, silence the guns, and allow the fleet to pass. It sounded simple. It was anything but. The landings began on the 25th of April. From the first moments, everything went wrong. The beaches were overlooked by cliffs held by Turkish defenders. The troops were slaughtered as they came ashore. Those who survived the initial assault found themselves pinned down, unable to advance, unable to retreat, dying by the thousands in the Mediterranean sun. The campaign dragged on for 8 months. Reinforcements arrived and were fed into the meat grinder. Disease killed as many men as bullets. The summer heat was unbearable. The winter cold was worse. And still the Allied forces could not break through. When it was finally over, when the last troops were evacuated in January of 1916, the cost was staggering. Approximately 44,000 Allied soldiers were dead. Total casualties on both sides exceeded 200,000. The Ottoman Empire remained in the war. Russia remained cut off. Nothing had been achieved except slaughter. Someone had to be blamed. Winston Churchill was the obvious choice. He had not been solely responsible. Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, had supported the land campaign. The military commanders had made catastrophic tactical errors. The war cabinet as a whole had approved each escalation. But Churchill had been the plan's most vocal champion. He had pushed hardest for action. He had overruled the doubters and dismissed the warnings. Now he paid the price. In May of 1915, a political crisis forced the formation of a coalition government. The Conservatives, who still despised Churchill for his party switch 11 years earlier, demanded his removal from the Admiralty as the price of their cooperation. Prime Minister Asquith agreed. Churchill was cast out. He was given a minor position, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a ceremonial role with no real power. He attended war cabinet meetings but could not influence decisions. He watched as others directed the war he had hoped to win. The humiliation was complete. And then the shadow descended. Churchill had experienced melancholy before. He had felt the weight of despair pressing down on him in moments of setback or disappointment. But this was different. This was a bleakness so profound, so all-consuming, that he could barely function. He gave it a name. He called it his black dog, a creature that followed him, that waited for moments of weakness, that could not be reasoned with or escaped. The black dog had been with him since childhood, he realized. It had been waiting in the corridors of Blenheim Palace, in the lonely dormitories of boarding school, in the anguished letters to a mother who never came. Now it emerged fully, and it nearly destroyed him. Clementine watched her husband with growing terror. He would sit for hours, staring at nothing, unable to speak or move. He talked about death. He talked about the futility of existence. He stood at the edge of train platforms and felt the pull of the tracks below. "I don't like standing near the edge of a platform when an express train is passing through," he confessed later. "I like to stand back and, if possible, get a pillar between me and the train. I don't like to stand by the side of a ship and look down into the water. A second's action would end everything." He was describing suicidal impulses with the clinical detachment of a man who had learned to observe his own demons from a distance. It was the only way to survive them. What saved him was paint. In the summer of 1915, at his lowest point, Churchill watched a friend's wife painting in the garden. Something about the activity caught his attention. The colors, the focus required, the way the brush transformed blank canvas into something meaningful. He asked to try. She gave him her children's watercolors. He made a few tentative strokes, and something shifted inside him. Within weeks, he had purchased oils, canvases, easels, and every other supply he could find. He painted obsessively, sometimes for hours at a time. The act of creation, of imposing order on chaos, of making something beautiful from nothing, provided a counterweight to the destruction that haunted his thoughts. "If it weren't for painting, I couldn't live," he said later. "I couldn't bear the strain of things." He would paint for the rest of his life. Over 500 canvases survive. They are not masterpieces, but they are competent, sometimes surprisingly good. More importantly, they kept him alive. When the black dog came, he could retreat to his easel and fight it with color and light. But painting alone was not enough. He needed action. He needed to prove that he was not the failure his enemies claimed. In November of 1915, Winston Churchill did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He went to war. At 41 years old, a former cabinet minister, he requested a commission in the army and was sent to the Western Front. He served first as a major, then as a lieutenant colonel commanding the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He lived in the trenches. He led men into danger. He shared their hardships and their risks. His soldiers were suspicious at first. They had heard of this politician who had come to play at war. They expected arrogance, incompetence, the casual disregard for enlisted men that characterized so many aristocratic officers. What they found was different. Churchill was fearless to the point of recklessness. He insisted on inspecting forward positions personally, often under fire. He improved conditions in the trenches, demanded better food and supplies for his men, and treated them with a respect that surprised everyone. He also had astonishing luck. Shells landed within feet of where he stood and failed to explode. A staff car that was supposed to carry him was destroyed by artillery. He had been delayed and missed it. Again and again, death reached for him and missed. He began to believe that he was being preserved for something, that fate had a purpose for him that had not yet been revealed. This conviction, some would call it arrogance, others would call it faith, would sustain him through the decades ahead. In May of 1916, his battalion was merged with another unit and Churchill returned to England. His military service was over. His political exile was not. The wilderness years had only just begun. In 1937, Winston Churchill sat before the Palestine Royal Commission and made a statement that would haunt his legacy forever. Asked about the rights of indigenous peoples in colonized lands, he was blunt. "I do not admit that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia," he declared. "I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, has come in and taken their place." This was not a private opinion shared in confidence. This was sworn testimony before an official government body, and it was entirely consistent with views Churchill had expressed throughout his life. He believed in racial hierarchy. He placed white Protestant Europeans at the top and arranged everyone else below in descending order of what he considered civilization. Indians were a beastly people with a beastly religion. Palestinians were barbaric hordes. The Chinese provoked his disgust. Black Africans were savages to be civilized by force if necessary. These views were not universal in his time. Many of his contemporaries found them extreme, even shocking. Leo Amory, a fellow conservative who served in the war cabinet during the Second World War, wrote in his diary that listening to Churchill talk about India was like listening to Adolf Hitler. "I didn't see much difference between his outlook and Hitler's," Amory recorded. This from a man who was Churchill's political ally, not his enemy. The comparison was not entirely fair. Churchill did not advocate genocide. He did not build death camps. But his indifference to the suffering of non-white peoples would have consequences measured in millions of lives. That reckoning lay in the future. In the 1920s and 30s, Churchill's racism was merely one of many factors that kept him isolated from power. He had returned to government after the war, serving as Secretary of State for War, then Colonial Secretary, then Chancellor of the Exchequer. Each position brought new controversies. As War Secretary in 1919, he proposed using chemical weapons against what he called uncivilized tribes in Iraq and against Bolshevik forces in Russia. Later critics would accuse him of advocating poison gas. This was not quite accurate. He specifically recommended tear gas, a non-lethal agent, rather than the deadly chemicals used on the Western Front. But the distinction mattered less than the attitude it revealed. He saw no moral problem with using any weapon against people he considered inferior. As colonial secretary, he supported the brutal tactics used against Irish Republicans. He did not create the notorious Black and Tans. That force already existed when he took office, but he defended their reprisals against the Irish Republican Army. When villages were burned and civilians shot, Churchill expressed no regret. The Irish remembered. They would remember for generations. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, he made the worst economic decision of his career. In 1925, he returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. Economists warned him the policy was disastrous. They were right. It overvalued the pound, crippled British exports, and contributed to the unemployment and misery that defined the late 1920s. By 1929, the Conservatives had lost power, and Churchill found himself in opposition. He would remain there for a decade. These were the wilderness years. He was excluded from government, distrusted by his own party, dismissed as a relic of a previous age. His warnings about the rising threat of Nazi Germany were ignored. His calls for rearmament were rejected. He was like Cassandra of ancient Greek legend, the prophetess cursed to speak the truth while no one believed her. Churchill warned of Hitler's threat year after year. Parliament yawned. The newspapers mocked. Nobody listened. But his isolation was not entirely the result of his prescience about Hitler. It was also the result of his own misjudgments. In the early 1930s, before the full horror of Nazism became apparent, Churchill expressed admiration for several authoritarian leaders. He praised Benito Mussolini's magnificent courage and amazing qualities of courage, comprehension, self-control, and perseverance. He made favorable comments about Hitler's early achievements in restoring German pride and reducing unemployment. These statements would later be quietly forgotten by his admirers, but they were part of the record. Churchill was not immune to the appeal of strong men who promised to restore order and national greatness. He simply recognized, earlier than most, that Hitler's version of strength posed an existential threat to Britain. In 1936, Churchill's political judgment failed him spectacularly. King Edward VIII, who had ascended to the throne earlier that year, wished to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The British establishment was horrified. The Church of England would not sanction such a marriage. The government demanded that Edward choose between the crown and the woman he loved. Churchill chose to support the king. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The British public did not share Churchill's romantic view of the situation. They saw a selfish monarch abandoning his duty for a twice-divorced American adventuress. When Churchill rose in the House of Commons to plead for more time, to urge that no irrevocable step be taken, he was shouted down. The scene was brutal. Members of Parliament jeered and booed. Churchill could barely make himself heard above the uproar. He left the chamber humiliated, his reputation at its lowest point since Gallipoli. Worse still, there were rumors that he had been drinking before the speech, that his slurred words and emotional outbursts were the result of alcohol rather than passion. Whether true or not, the perception damaged him further. He was 62 years old. His career appeared to be over. The wilderness seemed endless. Then, on the 1st of September 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland. Britain declared war. Churchill was recalled to the Admiralty, the same position he had held when Gallipoli destroyed him. It was as if fate were offering him a second chance, or perhaps another opportunity for disaster. 8 months later, as France collapsed and Britain stood alone, the man nobody wanted became the only man who could save them. On the 10th of May 1940, as German tanks smashed through the Ardennes and the Allied front disintegrated, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. His own party did not want him. The king did not want him, but there was no one else left. Neville Chamberlain, the architect of appeasement, had finally lost the confidence of Parliament. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was the establishment's preferred successor. But Halifax recognized that he could not lead a war from the House of Lords, and he declined the position. By default, by elimination, by the strange workings of fate, the job fell to the man who had been warning about this moment for a decade. Churchill wept when he received the king's commission. "I felt as if I were walking with destiny," he wrote later, "and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." He was 65 years old. He had waited his entire life for this moment, and he knew with terrible clarity how close Britain stood to annihilation. The war was going badly. Within weeks it would go worse. France was collapsing. The British expeditionary force was being driven toward the sea. The possibility of total defeat was not hypothetical, it was imminent. In the War Cabinet, voices urged negotiation. Lord Halifax argued that Britain should explore peace terms while it still had bargaining power. Mussolini had offered to mediate. Perhaps something could be salvaged from the wreckage. Churchill understood what such negotiations would mean. Once Britain admitted it could not win alone, once it showed weakness to Hitler, the game would be over. There would be no acceptable terms. There would only be submission, dressed up in diplomatic language. He fought Halifax in cabinet meetings that remained secret for decades. He maneuvered, persuaded, and when necessary, manipulated. He brought the outer cabinet into discussions, knowing that the broader group would support continued resistance. He made speeches that stiffened spines and hardened resolve. "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last," he told his colleagues, "let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." This was not rhetoric. This was policy. Churchill was prepared to see Britain destroyed rather than see it surrender. Whether this was courage or madness depended on one's perspective. What mattered was that he meant it, and everyone who heard him knew he meant it. The crisis passed. Halifax's peace initiative was quietly buried. Britain would fight on. But fighting on required terrible decisions. In July of 1940, Churchill ordered an attack on the French fleet anchored at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria. France had surrendered to Germany. Its navy might fall into German hands. Churchill could not allow this. British ships opened fire on their former allies. 1,300 French sailors died in minutes. The French government, now collaborating with Germany, broke diplomatic relations. Across France, Churchill's name became synonymous with treachery. He wept when he reported the action to Parliament, but he did not apologize. He did not express regret. He had done what was necessary. He would do it again. This was Churchill in the war years, ruthless when ruthlessness was required, sentimental when sentiment served his purposes, inspiring when inspiration was needed, and always performing. He understood that leadership in wartime was partly theater. The bulldog scowl, the V for victory sign, the cigar clenched between his teeth, these were props in a production designed to convince the British people that they could not lose. Behind the performance, the man was falling apart. His health was precarious. In December of 1941, while visiting Washington, he suffered a heart attack, concealed from everyone except his doctor. In 1943, pneumonia nearly killed him. Throughout it all, he drank whiskey from morning until night, functioning on a level of alcohol that would have incapacitated most men. His body was failing, but the show had to go on. And through it all, the wit remained. The savage, brilliant, inappropriate wit that made him impossible to hate even when he was being hateful. Lady Astor, his longtime political adversary, once confronted him at a dinner party. "Winston," she said, "if you were my husband, I would poison your tea." He did not hesitate. "Madam, if I were your husband, I would drink it." Another exchange became legendary. Bessie Braddock, a Labour member of Parliament, encountered him in a corridor. "Winston, you are drunk," she accused. "Yes, madam, I am," he replied. "But in the morning I shall be sober, and you will still be ugly." In Parliament, he was rebuked for calling an opponent a liar. The Speaker demanded he withdraw the remark. Churchill considered for a moment. "The gentleman is perhaps not an impudent liar," he said at last, "but he is a liar nonetheless." These moments of levity punctuated the gloom. They reminded everyone, including Churchill himself, that despair was not the only option, that even in the worst of times the human spirit could find reasons to laugh. But the laughter could not mask the moral compromises of total war. Churchill authorized the bombing of German cities, knowing that civilians would die by the tens of thousands. He accepted Stalin as an ally, knowing that the Soviet dictator was a monster whose crimes rivaled Hitler's. He made decisions that cost lives, Allied lives, enemy lives, civilian lives, with a frequency that would have destroyed a more sensitive soul. Perhaps it did destroy something in him. Perhaps the black dog fed on guilt he could never acknowledge. Perhaps the whiskey was not just habit but necessity, the only way to quiet the voices of the dead. He never spoke of such things. He could not afford to. The performance must continue. The bulldog must keep growling. The victory sign must keep flashing. Britain needed a symbol. Churchill gave them one. What it cost him only Clementine knew, and she never told. The war would be won, but the price of victory was still being calculated. And across the empire, in a province called Bengal, millions of people were about to pay that price with their lives. In 1943, while Winston Churchill was planning the liberation of Europe, 3 million people were starving to death in Bengal. When his Secretary of State for India begged for emergency food shipments, Churchill's response was to ask why Gandhi had not died yet. This was not a joke, or if it was, no one was laughing. The Bengal famine of 1943 remains the most troubling stain on Churchill's wartime record. It is the event that transforms him, in the eyes of many historians, from flawed hero to something far more disturbing. It is the catastrophe that his admirers prefer to forget and his critics refuse to forgive. The causes of the famine were multiple and complex. In 1942, Japan had conquered Burma, cutting off the rice imports that Bengal depended upon. The same year, a cyclone devastated the region's own rice crop. Colonial administrators had requisitioned boats and rice stocks as a precaution against Japanese invasion, disrupting the local food distribution network. Wartime inflation made what food remained unaffordable for the poor. By the spring of 1943, people were dying in the streets of Calcutta. Skeletal figures wandered the countryside, searching for anything edible. Parents sold their children. Corpses rotted in ditches because no one had the strength to bury them. The situation was not beyond remedy. Food existed. India as a whole was not short of grain. Other provinces had surpluses. Ships were available. What was lacking was the will to act. Leopold Amory, the Secretary of State for India, pleaded with the War Cabinet for help. He requested food shipments, emergency relief, anything that might stem the tide of death. Churchill was not interested. The Prime Minister's response, recorded in multiple sources, was contemptuous. He blamed the Indians themselves for the famine. They were breeding like rabbits, he said. They had brought this upon themselves through their own fecklessness. Why should British resources be diverted to save people who could not control their own population? When told that millions were dying, he asked why Gandhi, the leader of the Indian independence movement whom Churchill despised, had not died yet. The question was not merely callous. It revealed how Churchill viewed the subcontinent. Indian lives simply did not matter to him in the way that British lives did. They were abstractions, statistics, inconveniences to be managed rather than calamities to be mourned. Food shipments were eventually sent, but they were too little and too late. The death toll reached somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. The exact number will never be known. The dead were mostly poor, mostly rural, mostly invisible to the imperial administration that ruled them. Historians continue to debate Churchill's culpability. His defenders point out that he did not cause the cyclone, did not order the Japanese invasion of Burma, did not create the structural vulnerabilities of colonial Bengal. They note that shipping was scarce, that U-boats threatened supply lines, that the war demanded difficult choices about resource allocation. His critics respond that difficult choices are precisely where moral character is revealed. Churchill chose to prioritize military stockpiles over starving civilians. He chose to send food to already well-supplied regions while Bengal died. He chose to view Indian suffering with indifference bordering on satisfaction. Madhusri Mukherjee, the historian who has documented Churchill's role in the famine most thoroughly, concluded that his policies helped to cause the catastrophe and that his response definitely aggravated it. Other scholars dispute this assessment. The debate continues. What is not debatable is Churchill's attitude. His own words condemn him. He saw Indians as lesser people, unworthy of the concern he lavished on British subjects. This was the consistent expression of beliefs he had held for decades and would hold until his death. The Bengal famine did not diminish Churchill's reputation during his lifetime. Most British people never knew the details. Those who did know often shared his prejudices. The empire was built on the assumption that some lives mattered more than others. Churchill was simply more honest about this assumption than most. But posterity has a way of reassessing reputations. In the 21st century, as the legacy of colonialism faces long overdue scrutiny, the Bengal famine has become central to debates about who Churchill really was. The man who saved Western civilization from fascism was also the man who watched millions of colonial subjects starve and asked why more of them were not dying. Both things are true, neither cancels the other. This is the burden of examining the past, to hold contradictions without resolving them, to judge without pretending that judgment is simple. While Bengal starved, the war entered its final phase. Churchill met with Roosevelt and Stalin to plan the post-war world. These meetings would shape the fate of nations for generations to come. They would also reveal the limits of British power and the compromises Churchill was willing to make. In October of 1944, Churchill flew to Moscow for a private meeting with Stalin. The two men sat in the Kremlin, late at night, dividing up Eastern Europe like gangsters carving up territory. Churchill took a half-sheet of paper and wrote down a list of countries with percentages next to each one. Romania, 90% Soviet influence, 10% British. Greece, 90% British, 10% Soviet. Yugoslavia and Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, 75% Soviet. He pushed the paper across the table. Stalin looked at it, paused, then made a large tick with his blue pencil. The fate of millions of people was decided in less than a minute. This was the percentages agreement. It was never formally ratified. It was never made public during Churchill's lifetime, but it shaped the post-war settlement more than any official treaty. Churchill's defenders note that he was being realistic. The Red Army already occupied most of Eastern Europe. Britain had no power to challenge Soviet control. By negotiating spheres of influence, Churchill at least preserved Greece from communist domination, keeping the Eastern Mediterranean open to British shipping. His critics point out that this was precisely the kind of great power cynicism that the war was supposedly being fought to end. Poland, the country whose invasion had triggered British entry into the war, was not even on the list. Its fate had already been decided. It would be Soviet, completely and permanently. Churchill had fought a war for Poland's independence and then traded that independence away without a second thought. He knew what he was doing. He knew what Stalin was. I have not become the king's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, he had declared in 1942. But that was exactly what he was doing. The empire was dying. Britain was exhausted. The future belonged to America and Russia. Churchill was simply managing the decline as gracefully as possible. There was one more secret plan, never executed, that revealed just how clearly Churchill saw the coming conflict with the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1945, he ordered his military planners to draw up a scheme for war against Russia. It was called Operation Unthinkable. The plan envisioned a surprise attack on Soviet forces in Europe to be launched on the 1st of July, 1945, just weeks after Germany's surrender. British, American, and rearmed German troops would strike east, aiming to push the Soviets back and liberate Poland. The goal was to force Stalin to accept terms that would preserve Eastern European independence. The military assessment was blunt. The operation was virtually impossible. Soviet forces outnumbered the Western Allies by nearly 3-1. An attack would almost certainly fail. The plan was shelved. But the fact that it was considered at all revealed Churchill's thinking. He understood, before almost anyone else in the West, that the wartime alliance with Stalin would not survive the peace. The Cold War that would dominate the next 40 years was already taking shape in his mind. He was prepared to fight it immediately if necessary. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. The war in the Pacific continued until August, and somewhere between those two dates, Winston Churchill's world collapsed. On the 26th of July, 1945, Churchill sat at the Potsdam Conference, negotiating the fate of post-war Europe with Truman and Stalin. An aide entered the room and handed him a telegram. He read it twice, as if the words might change. They did not. The British people had thrown him out of office. The election results were a landslide. Labour won 393 seats. The Conservatives were reduced to 213. The man who had led Britain through its bleakest hour, who had inspired the nation with his words and his will, was rejected by the voters he had saved. Churchill was devastated. He had expected gratitude. He had expected vindication. Instead, he received a lesson in the ruthlessness of democracy. The British people did not vote for the past. They voted for the future. And they wanted a future that Churchill's Conservatives could not provide. Clementine, ever practical, tried to comfort him. "It may be a blessing in disguise," she said. He was not consoled. "At the moment," he replied, "it seems quite effectively disguised." The defeat triggered a collapse that had been building for years. The black dog returned with renewed ferocity. Churchill sank into a despair deeper than anything since Gallipoli. He was 70 years old. His life's work was complete, and the nation he had saved had cast him aside. He retreated to Chartwell and painted. He worked on his war memoirs, which would eventually run to 6 volumes and earn him the Nobel Prize in Literature. He drank. He brooded. He waited for the call that might never come. And the sorrows multiplied. The Churchill children had grown up in the shadow of a great man, and shadows are cold places. Each of them, in different ways, bore the scars of that upbringing. Now, as their father aged and faltered, their own lives began to fall apart. Diana, the eldest, had struggled with melancholy for years. She had inherited her father's black dog, along with his intensity and his inability to find peace. Her first marriage ended in divorce. Her second marriage, to the conservative politician Duncan Sandys, produced children but not happiness. By the late 1940s, she was disappearing into a void from which she would never fully emerge. Randolph, the only son, was perhaps the deepest wound of all. He was supposed to be the heir, the continuation of the Churchill line, the vessel for his father's ambitions. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about the dangers of being born to greatness. He had his father's intelligence, his father's aggression, his father's need for attention. What he lacked was his father's discipline, his father's luck, and most crucially, his father's historical moment. There was no war for Randolph to win, no crisis that demanded his particular gifts. He was a great man's son in an age that did not need great men. He drank too much. He gambled recklessly. He insulted people with a cruelty that went beyond his father's wit into something more destructive. His political career failed before it began. His marriages collapsed. His relationship with Winston deteriorated into mutual disappointment and recrimination. The father had neglected the son, just as Lord Randolph had neglected Winston. The pattern repeated across generations, as such patterns do. Randolph would die in 1968, 3 years after his father. His biography of Winston left unfinished, his potential unrealized, his bitterness unresolved. Sarah, the middle daughter, chose a different path of destruction. She became an actress, defying her father's wishes. Her first marriage to the comedian Vic Oliver caused a family rupture that took years to heal. Churchill despised Oliver and made no secret of it. The marriage failed, as everyone except Sarah had predicted. What followed was a descent into alcoholism that would span decades. Sarah was arrested multiple times for public drunkenness. She made scenes in hotels and restaurants. She embarrassed the family name with a consistency that suggested either profound self-destruction or profound indifference to consequences. Her father watched helplessly. He loved Sarah. He had always loved her, perhaps more than the others because she was so obviously troubled. But he could not save her. He could not save any of them. His powers of leadership, so effective on the world stage, were useless within his own family. Then there was Marigold. She was the one who did not grow up to disappoint anyone. She died before she had the chance. Marigold Churchill, the fourth child, was born in 1918. She was called the Duckadilly, a baby nickname that stuck because it captured her cheerful, waddling charm. Of all the Churchill children, she seemed the most purely happy, the least burdened by the weight of her parentage. In August of 1921, while staying with a governess at the seaside, Marigold developed a sore throat. It was tonsillitis, the doctors said. Nothing serious, but the infection spread. Septicemia set in. Within days, the 2-year-old child was fighting for her life. At the graveside in Kensal Green Cemetery, something broke inside Winston Churchill. The man who had faced Mauser bullets without flinching, who had stood unmoved as shells exploded around him, who had built his entire public persona on unshakable resolve. That man dissolved. His shoulders heaved, tears streamed down his face. He made no attempt to hide them. "My poor little Duckadilly," he whispered, using the baby nickname that would never be spoken again in that household. Clementine stood beside him, her own grief complicated by guilt. She had been at a tennis tournament in Scotland when Marigold fell ill. By the time she reached her daughter's bedside, it was too late. The child was already gone. They would rarely speak of Marigold in the years that followed. The wound was too deep for words, but Winston kept her photograph in his study until the day he died. Some losses cannot be survived. They can only be carried. Only Mary, the youngest, seemed to escape the family curse. She grew up to be stable, sensible, devoted to her parents without being consumed by them. She would become her father's protector in his final years, managing his public image, guarding his privacy, defending his legacy against critics who emerged after his death. But Mary's success only highlighted the failures of her siblings. For every child who thrived in the Churchill household, 3 others were broken by it. The great man's greatness cast a shadow that stunted everyone who grew up within it. After the 1945 defeat, Churchill might have retired gracefully. He was 70. He had achieved more than any British politician since the younger Pitt. He had nothing left to prove. He could not do it. The hunger for power, for relevance, for the roar of the crowd, it was too deep, too essential to who he was. He became leader of the opposition, waiting, watching, hoping for another chance. It came in 1951. The Labour government, exhausted by 6 years of austerity and crisis, lost the general election. Churchill, now 76 years old, returned to 10 Downing Street. The second premiership was a diminished thing compared to the first. There was no existential crisis to meet, no enemy at the gates, no speeches to rally a nation on the brink of annihilation. There was only the grinding work of peacetime government. managing the economy, maintaining alliances, presiding over the slow dissolution of the empire. Churchill was not suited for such work. He had never been an administrator. He was a leader of men in crisis, not a manager of bureaucracies in normalcy. And he was old, visibly, undeniably old in a way that no amount of performance could disguise. His colleagues noticed the decline. His hearing was failing. His memory was unreliable. Cabinet meetings dragged on as he lost the thread of discussions or repeated points he had already made. The man who had once dominated every room with his energy and intellect now struggled to keep up with the pace of government. Then in June of 1953, catastrophe struck. The dinner party at 10 Downing Street was proceeding normally. Ministers chatted, glasses clinked. Then someone noticed that the Prime Minister had stopped speaking. Churchill sat frozen in his chair, his left arm hanging limp, the left side of his face drooping like melted wax. He tried to speak. The words came out slurred, incomprehensible. "The Prime Minister is tired," someone announced to the guests. "The evening is concluded." They were ushered out before they could understand what they had witnessed. Within the hour, doctors confirmed the worst. The leader of the free world had suffered a massive stroke, and for the next 3 months the British public would have no idea. The cover-up that followed was extraordinary in its scope and audacity. The cabinet was told that Churchill needed rest. Parliament was told the same thing. The press, in an era before aggressive investigative journalism, dutifully reported what it was told. The British public had no idea that their leader had nearly died and was now struggling to recover from a devastating medical event. The Queen knew. The Cabinet Secretary knew. A handful of trusted ministers knew. They all agreed to maintain the deception. Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, issued reassuring statements that were technically true but profoundly misleading. The machinery of democracy continued to function while its supposed leader lay in bed at Chartwell, relearning how to walk. He recovered, or partly recovered. By autumn, he was back at work, presiding over cabinet meetings, making speeches, maintaining the pretense that nothing had happened. But he was never the same. The strokes, for there had been smaller ones before and there would be more after, had taken something essential. The fire was dimming. He wanted to hold a summit with the Soviets. The Cold War terrified him. He had predicted it, after all, and understood better than most what nuclear weapons meant for humanity. He believed that personal diplomacy, the kind of face-to-face negotiation he had conducted with Roosevelt and Stalin, might reduce tensions and avert catastrophe. His own party blocked him. The Americans were not interested. Eisenhower, the man Churchill had worked with throughout the war, now treated the aged Prime Minister with barely concealed condescension. The special relationship was not so special anymore. In 1954, Churchill turned 80. Parliament commissioned a portrait to mark the occasion. The artist, Graham Sutherland, was a modernist known for unflinching honesty. He painted what he saw: an old man slumped in a chair, the weight of years and disappointments visible in every brushstroke. Churchill hated it. "This is a remarkable example of modern art," he said at the presentation ceremony. His voice dripped with contempt. "It certainly combines force and candor." He paused, letting the silence build. "It is disgustingly revealing." The audience laughed nervously. Churchill was not joking. After his death, Clementine had the portrait secretly destroyed. She burned it, or had it burned, erasing the image that had captured her husband's decline so mercilessly. The destruction was kept secret for decades. When it finally emerged, critics were outraged at the vandalism of an important artwork. Clementine's defenders understood. Some truths are too painful to preserve. In 1959, 2 more strokes struck him. That same year, a cigar burn on his finger became infected. Gangrene set in. The doctors considered amputation. In the end, they saved the finger, but the incident was another reminder of how fragile the old warrior had become. On the 5th of April 1955, Winston Churchill resigned as Prime Minister. He was 80 years old. His party had made clear that it was time. Anthony Eden, his long-suffering heir apparent, finally inherited the position he had been promised for years. Churchill left office with full honors, showered with praise for his wartime leadership, assured of his place in posterity. But the private man was devastated. Without power, without the constant stimulation of government, without the sense of purpose that had driven him for 60 years, he was lost. In 1963, he made his last visit to the House of Commons. He had to be helped to his seat. Members who remembered his thundering wartime speeches now watched an old man struggle to follow the debate. A young MP approached him afterward. "Sir Winston," he said, "it is an honor." Churchill looked at him with rheumy eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a ghost of his old wit, "Young man, I have no idea who you are, but I suspect you will remind me." He never returned to the Commons again. The years that followed were a long, slow diminishment. He remained a member of Parliament but rarely spoke. He attended events but often sat silent, lost in thought or simply lost. The brilliant conversationalist became a man who could go days without uttering a word. He painted when he could. He read. He sat in the gardens at Chartwell, watching the light change over the Weald of Kent. Clementine cared for him with exhausted devotion, managing the household, protecting him from visitors who might tire him, maintaining the routines that kept him anchored to life. Their marriage, tested by decades of crisis and compromise, had reached a kind of peace. They had survived together. That counted for something, perhaps for everything. In 1963, the first of the final blows struck. Diana Churchill, eldest daughter, troubled soul, carrier of the family affliction, took her own life. She swallowed an overdose of barbiturates, just as her grandmother, Jenny's mother, had done decades before. She was 54 years old. Winston was too frail to fully comprehend the news. By that point, his awareness of the world around him had faded to a flicker. He understood that something terrible had happened, that one of his children was gone, but the full weight of the loss may not have registered. Perhaps this was a mercy, perhaps he had suffered enough. The family shadow had claimed another victim. It had passed from generation to generation like a genetic curse. The black dog that Winston had named and fought, the melancholy that Diana had inherited, the destructive impulses that seemed woven into the Churchill blood. Randolph was drinking himself to death. Sarah was lost in her own spirals of addiction. Only Mary remained whole, and even she bore the scars of growing up in that brilliant, terrible household. Churchill himself was fading. The man who had stood against the might of Nazi Germany, who had rallied a nation with the power of his words, who had bent events to his will through sheer force of personality. That man was gone. What remained was a shell, increasingly empty, waiting for an end that would not be hurried. On the 15th of January, 1965, exactly 70 years to the day after his father's death, Winston Churchill suffered his final stroke. The stroke came on a winter morning, in the bedroom at Hyde Park Gate, where Winston Churchill had spent so many of his final years. The house was quiet, as it had been quiet for months now. The silence of a home that had once echoed with political debates, literary discussions, and the booming voice of its famous occupant, now reduced to the hushed routines of nursing care and waiting. One moment he was there, diminished but present, his eyes tracking the movements of those around him with the faded alertness of a man who had once commanded armies and bent nations to his will. The next, he was somewhere else entirely, a place beyond speech, beyond movement, beyond the reach of those who loved him and those who merely needed him. The date was the 15th of January, 1965. Winston Churchill was 90 years old. He had survived longer than anyone had expected, longer perhaps than he himself had wished. The last decade had been a slow withdrawal from the world he had once dominated, a gradual dimming of the extraordinary light that had blazed so brightly during the war years. And now, on this cold January morning, the final darkness was descending. It was exactly 70 years to the day since Lord Randolph Churchill had died in this same city, consumed by whatever mysterious illness had destroyed his brilliant mind. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidence. Winston Churchill, who had spent his entire life trying to redeem his father's legacy, who had entered politics to continue his father's work, who had idealized the man who never had time for him, Winston Churchill would leave the world on the anniversary of his father's departure from it. If he had been conscious, he would have appreciated the dramatic irony. He had always had a writer's instinct for such things, an understanding of how narrative shapes meaning. His entire life had been, in some sense, a story he was telling about himself, a tale of redemption, of destiny fulfilled, of the outsider who rises to save the world. The symmetrical ending was the kind of detail he would have invented if fate hadn't provided it. Perhaps in some unconscious way, he had willed it so. The doctors came quickly when the household realized what was happening. They examined him with the grave efficiency of men who knew their patient's importance to the nation and their own limitations in the face of mortality. They consulted with one another in hushed voices, reviewed the charts that documented years of declining health, checked the vital signs that were slowly but unmistakably failing. Then they delivered their verdict to the waiting family. The damage was catastrophic. This stroke, following upon so many others, had devastated what remained of his neurological function. The brain that had conceived the Dardanelles campaign and the speeches that saved Britain, the brain that had written 40 books and painted 500 canvases, the brain that had contained more historical knowledge than most university libraries, that brain was now beyond repair. There would be no recovery this time. There would be no more rallies, no more comebacks, no more defiance of the odds that had marked his extraordinary life. The man who had survived bullets in 4 wars, who had walked away from a plane crash, who had recovered from a heart attack that his doctor concealed from the world, who had bounced back from strokes that would have killed lesser men. That man had finally met an enemy he could not defeat. It was now simply a matter of waiting for the end. The vigil began. For 9 days, Winston Churchill lay unconscious while the world watched and waited. His breathing was shallow, irregular, sustained only by the stubborn vitality that had carried him through 90 years of living at an intensity that would have exhausted most people in half that time. The doctors monitored his condition around the clock, but there was little they could do except keep him comfortable and wait for nature to take its course. Bulletins were issued from the house at regular intervals, carefully worded statements that tracked his decline without quite admitting its finality. Sir Winston passed a restful night. Sir Winston's condition remains unchanged. Sir Winston continues to hold his own. The phrases were designed to inform without alarming, to prepare the public for the inevitable while maintaining the fiction that hope remained. The press gathered outside 28 Hyde Park Gate, cameras ready, notebooks open, waiting for the announcement that everyone knew was coming. Reporters stamped their feet against the January cold, traded speculation about timing and funeral arrangements, filed human interest stories about the neighbors and the curious onlookers who had begun to congregate. The death watch had become a media event, as everything in Churchill's life eventually became. But it was the ordinary people who gave the scene its emotional weight. They came without being summoned, without organization or coordination, drawn by something they could not quite articulate. They stood in the cold for hours, sometimes entire days, speaking in low voices about what Churchill had meant to them, what his voice on the radio had meant during the war, what it felt like to know that the last living connection to that extraordinary time was slipping away. Some were veterans who had served under him, old men now with medals on their chests and memories they rarely shared. Some were women who remembered huddling around the wireless during the Blitz, taking courage from the growling voice that promised victory when victory seemed impossible. Some were young people who had never known the war but who understood, from their parents' stories and their history lessons, that something important was ending. They brought flowers, laying them against the railings outside the house. They brought photographs, images of Churchill from every era of his long public life: the young cavalry officer, the First Lord of the Admiralty, the wartime Prime Minister with his cigar and his V sign. They brought handwritten notes expressing gratitude, admiration, love for a man most of them had never met, but all of them felt they knew. Inside the house, Clementine kept watch. She was 80 years old herself, worn down by decades of caring for a man who had never been easy to care for. Her health was fragile. The nervous exhaustion that had plagued her throughout their marriage had never really gone away, only evolved into new forms of weariness. Her energy was depleted by years of managing a household in perpetual financial crisis, of protecting her husband from demands that might overtax his failing strength, of watching the man she had married slowly disappear into age and illness. But she remained at his bedside, hour after hour, day after day, refusing to leave except when exhaustion absolutely demanded it. She held the hand that had signed declarations of war and letters of love, that had gestured dramatically during speeches that changed the course of events, that had wielded paintbrushes with surprising delicacy and built brick walls with unexpected skill. She held that hand and she talked to him, though he could not hear. She told him about the flowers that had arrived, bouquets from heads of state and hand-picked posies from ordinary citizens. She told him about the messages of support pouring in from around the world, the telegrams and letters expressing gratitude for what he had done and sorrow at what was happening. She told him about the crowds outside, the people who had come to keep vigil with the family, the nation that was holding its breath and praying for a miracle it knew would not come. She reminded him of their life together, the dinner party in 1908 when they had been seated next to each other and he had finally found the courage to speak to her, the swift courtship that had followed, the proposal at the Temple of Diana at Blenheim, the wedding at St. Margaret's that had made headlines across the country, the early years of their marriage when his career was rising and their future seemed limitless. She reminded him of the children they had raised, Diana and Randolph and Sarah and Marigold and Mary, each of them a joy and a heartbreak in their own way. She reminded him of Chartwell, the house he had loved and she had hated, where they had spent so many years together, where he had painted and written and built and dreamed. She reminded him of the war years, when the weight of the world had rested on his shoulders, and she had tried in her limited way to help him carry it. She was saying goodbye in the only way she knew how, to the man who had been the center of her existence for 57 years. Whatever frustration she had felt, whatever resentment she had harbored, whatever private sorrows she had never shared, none of it mattered now. There was only love, complicated and imperfect as it had always been, but love nonetheless. There was only gratitude for the life they had shared, however difficult that life had sometimes been. There was only the wish, desperate and futile, that this moment could be postponed just a little longer. The children came and went, each carrying their own complicated burden of love and resentment, gratitude and grief. Mary was there constantly, the dutiful daughter who had always been closest to her father, who had organized her entire adult life around supporting and protecting him. She had been his companion in his final years, accompanying him on trips, managing his correspondence, shielding him from visitors who might tire him or upset him. Now she sat with Clementine, helped manage the household, dealt with the endless stream of inquiries from press and public. Her composure never cracked, though the strain was visible in her eyes. She had spent her life being strong for her parents. She would be strong for them now. Randolph appeared, traveling down from his home in Suffolk, where he had been working on the official biography of his father, a project he would never complete, a final failure to add to all the others. He was 53 years old and looked older, his face bloated by years of heavy drinking, his hands trembling with the early signs of the illness that would kill him just 3 years later. He had his father's intelligence and his father's pugnacity, but he had never found his father's discipline or his father's luck. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of a great man, and the shadow had stunted him. He sat by his father's bed and wept. He wept for the relationship they had never had, for the conversations that had always turned into arguments, for the approval he had sought all his life and never really earned. He wept for the biography that would remain unfinished, the definitive account of his father's life that he had hoped would finally prove his worth. He wept for all the things he had wanted to say and never said, all the questions he had wanted to ask and never asked, all the wounds that would now never heal. Whatever anger he felt toward Winston, whatever resentment had poisoned their bond over the years, the sense of being ignored, dismissed, found wanting, it dissolved in the presence of death. There was only loss now, raw and overwhelming. There was only the terrible recognition that it was too late to make things right, that the chance for reconciliation had passed, that whatever they might have been to each other would now remain forever unrealized. Sarah came too, traveling from wherever her wandering life had taken her at the moment. She was 50 years old, still beautiful in a damaged way, still carrying the wounds of a life that had never quite worked out. Her acting career had faded. Her marriages had failed. Her struggles with alcohol had led to public embarrassments that made headlines around the world. The Prime Minister's daughter arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, a Churchill reduced to tabloid fodder. She arrived at Hyde Park Gate looking haunted, fragile, as if she might shatter at any moment. She kissed her father's forehead and whispered something no one else could hear, perhaps an apology, perhaps a declaration of love, perhaps simply goodbye. Then she retreated to a corner of the room and sat in silence, watching the man who had never quite known how to love her slip away. Winston had always been baffled by Sarah, by her artistic temperament, by her refusal to live the conventional life he had expected for his daughters. He had disapproved of her first marriage, to the comedian Vic Oliver, with a vehemence that had nearly destroyed their relationship. He had watched her subsequent struggles with a mixture of concern and incomprehension, wanting to help but not knowing how, loving her but unable to express that love in ways she could receive. Now she sat in his bedroom, surrounded by the family she had always felt slightly apart from, waiting for the end of a relationship that had never been quite what either of them needed. Diana, of course, could not come. Diana had gone ahead 2 years earlier to whatever waited on the other side. She had taken her own life in October of 1963, swallowing an overdose of barbiturates in her London flat, ending a struggle with depression that had lasted most of her adult life. The black dog that Winston had named and fought, the melancholy that ran through the Churchill blood like a genetic curse. Diana had inherited it, had battled it for decades, and had finally succumbed to it. Winston had been too frail to fully understand what had happened when they told him Diana was dead. His mind was already failing by then, his grip on reality loosening day by day. He had seemed to comprehend that something terrible had occurred, that one of his children was gone, but whether the full weight of the loss had registered was impossible to know. Perhaps this was a mercy. Perhaps he had already suffered enough grief in his 90 years. Perhaps being spared the full understanding of his eldest daughter's suicide was one final kindness from a fate that had not always been kind. Now, as Winston lay dying, Diana's absence was a presence in the room, a reminder of all the ways this family had been broken by the weight of one man's greatness, a testament to the price that had been paid by those who lived in his shadow. On the morning of the 24th of January, the 9th day of the vigil, Clementine noticed a change in his breathing. The intervals between breaths grew longer. The pauses stretched into silences that seemed to last forever. The family gathered close, forming a circle around the bed where the old lion lay. A nurse checked his pulse. A doctor listened to his chest. The room was very quiet, so quiet that they could hear the sounds of the city outside, the rumble of traffic, the distant cry of a street vendor, London going about its business on what would turn out to be an extraordinary day. Clementine held his hand. Mary stood at the foot of the bed, tears streaming silently down her face. Randolph stood frozen, unable to move or speak, his usual bluster completely absent. Sarah sat in her corner, hugging herself as if against a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. And then, so quietly that at first no one was certain it had happened, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill stopped breathing. There was a moment of absolute stillness. Then Clementine bent over him and kissed his forehead, a final gesture of tenderness from the woman who had loved him for 57 years. The doctor stepped forward, checked for vital signs he knew he would not find, and noted the time of death. It was shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. The nurse drew the sheet over his face. It was over. 90 years of living, of fighting, of failing and rising and failing again. 90 years of words and deeds that had shaped the 20th century more profoundly than perhaps any other individuals. 90 years of brilliance and blindness, courage and cruelty, triumph and disaster, love and neglect. All of it ended now, in a quiet bedroom in Kensington, with his family gathered around him and the winter light filtering through the curtains. The announcement was made within the hour. Radio programs were interrupted mid-sentence. Television screens flickered with the solemn faces of newscasters who had been preparing for this moment for days. The BBC played the national anthem. Church bells began to toll across the country. Around the world, in every nation where the news could reach, people stopped what they were doing and absorbed the information that Winston Churchill was dead. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Flags were lowered to half-staff across Britain and in capitals around the globe. Parliament was suspended, its business put aside so that members could pay tribute to the man who had dominated that chamber for more than 60 years. Messages of condolence poured in from every head of state, every government, every international organization, expressions of grief and gratitude from a world that understood, whatever its complicated feelings about British imperialism, that it owed this man an unpayable debt. President Lyndon Johnson spoke for America. He was a giant of our age, the embodiment of British defiance to tyranny. Charles de Gaulle, who had quarreled bitterly with Churchill during the war, set aside old grievances. In the great drama, he was the greatest. Even the Soviet Union, the Cold War enemy Churchill had warned against for 20 years, acknowledged his passing with respect. The Queen, breaking with centuries of precedent, ordered a state funeral. This was an honor normally reserved for monarchs, a recognition so rare that the last commoner to receive it had been the Duke of Wellington more than a century earlier. There was no debate about whether Churchill deserved such recognition. The only question was whether any ceremony could be grand enough to match the life being commemorated. It was fitting. He had, after all, saved the state. Whatever else could be said about him, and there was much to be said, not all of it flattering. He had stood in the breach when the breach needed standing in. He had held the line when the line needed holding. He had given voice to a nation's defiance when defiance was all that stood between civilization and barbarism. The funeral was set for the 30th of January, 6 days after his death. In the intervening time, his body would lie in state at Westminster Hall, the ancient heart of British democracy, where kings and queens had been crowned and condemned for nearly 1,000 years. The public would be invited to pay their respects, and the authorities braced themselves for crowds of unprecedented size. They underestimated. 321,000 people filed past the coffin in 3 days and 3 nights. They came from every walk of life, every corner of the kingdom, every generation that had lived through the war years, and every generation that had grown up hearing about them. The queue stretched for miles along the Thames embankment, snaking through the January cold, moving slowly but never stopping as mourner after mourner paid their final respects. Veterans came in their medals and their regimental ties, some weeping openly, remembering the voice that had sustained them through the darkest nights of the war. They remembered the speeches they had heard on crackling radios in barracks and bunkers, the words that had made them believe victory was possible when everything suggested it was not. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." Those words had been more than rhetoric. They had been a lifeline, a reason to keep going when reason counseled despair. Workers came in their overalls and their flat caps, taking time off from factories and shops and docks to honor the man who had asked them to give their blood, toil, tears, and sweat. They came from the shipyards of the Clyde and the coal mines of Wales, from the textile mills of Lancashire and the steelworks of Sheffield. They were not natural Churchill voters, these working men and women. Many of them had supported the Labour Party that threw him out of office in 1945, but they remembered what he had done in 1940, and they came to say thank you. Women came who remembered huddling around the wireless during the Blitz, drawing courage from that growling voice while bombs fell outside, and the future seemed impossibly dark. They came with their daughters and their granddaughters, passing on the memory of what it had felt like to be afraid, and then to hear Winston Churchill telling them that fear could be conquered, that they were part of something greater than themselves, that history would remember their courage even if they doubted it themselves. Children came with their parents, too young to remember the war but old enough to understand that something important was ending. They stood in the queue for hours, patient and quiet, absorbing the solemnity of the occasion, learning without being told that some people matter so much that an entire nation stops to mourn them. The queue moved slowly through the January cold, 24 hours a day, never stopping even in the middle of the night. People waited for 6 hours, 8 hours, sometimes more, stamping their feet against the chill, blowing on their hands, sustained by flasks of tea and sandwiches, and the sense that they were participating in something historic. Strangers talked to each other as strangers do in queues, sharing memories, swapping stories, united by a common purpose that transcended all the usual British reserve. When they finally reached Westminster Hall, they fell silent. The great medieval space, with its hammer-beam roof and its centuries of history, had been transformed into a chapel of mourning. The coffin lay on a catafalque in the center of the hall, draped in the Union Jack, illuminated by tall candles that cast flickering shadows on the ancient stone walls. At each corner of the catafalque, an officer from one of the armed services stood motionless at attention, changing guard at regular intervals in a ceremony of silent precision. Most people paused for only a moment, a bow, a sign of the cross, a whispered word of thanks or farewell, before moving on to make room for those behind them. But in that moment, something passed between the living and the dead, some acknowledgement of debt and loss that words could not capture. Then they were gone, back out into the cold and the crowds, making way for the next mourner in the endless queue. The funeral itself, on the 30th of January, was a spectacle unlike anything Britain had seen in living memory. It began at Westminster Hall, where the coffin was transferred from the catafalque to a gun carriage for the journey to St. Paul's Cathedral. The gun carriage was the same one that had borne the bodies of Queen Victoria and King George VI, a piece of living history now pressed into service for the greatest commoner of them all. It was drawn by naval ratings rather than horses, a tribute to Churchill's long association with the Royal Navy, from his years as First Lord of the Admiralty through 2 world wars. The procession moved slowly through the streets of London, following a route that had been planned with the meticulous attention to detail that Churchill himself would have appreciated. Past Parliament, where he had served for more than 60 years and delivered the speeches that would be remembered for centuries. Past Whitehall, where he had directed the war from the underground bunkers that still bore the marks of his presence. Past the great landmarks of British power and history, all of them now paying tribute to the man who had done more than any other to ensure their survival. The route was lined with soldiers, sailors, and airmen standing at attention, their heads bowed, their weapons reversed in the traditional salute to the dead. Behind them, crowds packed every inch of available space, on the sidewalks, in the windows of office buildings, on rooftops and balconies, anywhere that offered a glimpse of the procession. Police estimated that 1 million people lined the route, standing in respectful silence as the cortege passed. Big Ben fell silent as the gun carriage approached Parliament, its famous chimes stilled for only the second time in its history. The first time had been during the war, when the bells were reserved to warn of invasion. Now they were silenced again, in tribute to the man who had ensured that invasion never came. At St. Paul's Cathedral, the greatest gathering of world leaders ever assembled for a funeral waited to receive the coffin. 112 nations had sent representatives, presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens, generals and diplomats, leaders of the free world and leaders of the communist bloc, united for once in mourning for a man who had shaped all their lives. Dwight Eisenhower was there, the supreme Allied commander who had worked with Churchill throughout the war and who had sometimes clashed with him. Charles de Gaulle was there, the French leader whose relationship with Churchill had been one of the most turbulent of the war years. The crowned heads of Europe were there, the kings and queens of the nations Churchill had helped to liberate. The leaders of the Commonwealth were there, representing the empire that Churchill had loved and that was now dissolving into independent nations. The service was magnificent and solemn, conducted according to the rites of the Church of England, filled with the hymns that Churchill had chosen himself years earlier when planning his own farewell. The battle hymn of the Republic echoed through the vaulted space, its thundering affirmation of righteous struggle. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, perfectly suited to the warrior being honored. He who would valiant be followed, Bunyan's call to pilgrimage and perseverance. Fight the good fight, concluded the musical portion, a final declaration of the martial spirit that had defined Churchill's life. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered the eulogy, speaking of courage and sacrifice, of duty and destiny, of a man who had been called by Providence to serve his nation in its hour of greatest need. The words were eloquent and fitting, but in a sense they were superfluous. Everyone in that cathedral knew why they were there. Everyone understood what was being mourned and what was being celebrated. Even in death, Winston Churchill was performing. He had staged his exit with the same theatrical instinct that had marked his entire career, choosing every element of the ceremony to reinforce the narrative he wanted posterity to remember. The hymns spoke of battle and faith, of struggle and ultimate triumph. They said nothing of Bengal, nothing of empire, nothing of the millions who had suffered under policies he had championed. This was Churchill's final edit of his own story, and it was masterful. After the service, the coffin was carried from the cathedral and placed on a launch called the Havengor for the journey upriver to Waterloo Station. As the vessel made its way along the Thames, past the docks where generations of British workers had labored to build the ships and load the cargoes that had made Britain great, something extraordinary happened. The cranes of the dockyards dipped their jibs in salute. These massive machines, symbols of industrial labor and working-class toil, bowed their steel necks as the coffin passed. It was a spontaneous gesture from the dock workers, unplanned and unrehearsed, a tribute from the men whose fathers and grandfathers had answered Churchill's call to arms in 1940. The image became the defining photograph of the funeral, reproduced in newspapers around the world, remembered long after the official ceremonies had faded from memory. The cranes bowing to the coffin, the machinery of labor honoring the man who had called upon the workers to fight and sacrifice and endure. Whatever Churchill's politics, and he had never been a friend of the labor movement, had broken strikes and battled unions and represented everything the workers' parties opposed. He had spoken for the common people in their hour of greatest need. He had put into words what they felt but could not articulate, the determination to resist, the refusal to surrender, the conviction that some things were worth any sacrifice. They had not forgotten. From Waterloo Station, a special train carried the coffin to Oxfordshire, to the village of Bladon, where Winston Churchill would be laid to rest near the palace where he had been born. The railway line had been closed for the day, all regular service suspended, so that the funeral train could make its solemn journey through the English countryside. At every station along the route, crowds had gathered to watch it pass. They stood on platforms and bridges, in fields and farmyards, lining the tracks for mile after mile. Many of them had traveled hours to be there, taking up positions in the early morning darkness so they would not miss the moment when the train came through. When it appeared, they removed their hats, bowed their heads, stood in silence as the coffin of Winston Churchill passed by. The burial at Bladon was private, attended only by family and close friends. The crowds and the cameras were left behind at the railway station. The pomp and pageantry were over. What remained was intimate, personal. A family saying goodbye to a husband, a father, a grandfather, a man they had loved imperfectly and been loved by imperfectly but loved nonetheless. The churchyard at St. Martin's, Bladon, was tiny, peaceful, surrounded by the rolling hills of Oxfordshire. The grave had been dug near the graves of Lord Randolph and Jenny, Winston's parents, reunited now in death as they had rarely been in life. There was space reserved for Clementine, who would join him 12 years later. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, the winter sun broke through the clouds, a moment of light in the gray January afternoon that seemed, to those who were there, almost miraculous. The priest spoke the ancient words of committal. Earth was scattered on the coffin. Prayers were said, and then it was over. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, born November 30th, 1874, died January 24th, 1965, was at rest at last. The grave is marked by a simple stone, similar to the stones that mark the graves of his parents nearby. There is no elaborate monument, no grand memorial, nothing to suggest the magnitude of the life it commemorates. Just a name, the dates of birth and death, and the ground of England that he had loved and served and saved. Visitors still come, more than half a century later. They come from Britain and from around the world, drawn by curiosity or admiration, or simply the desire to stand for a moment in the presence of history. They look at the modest stone, read the simple inscription, and try to reconcile what they see with what they know. How could this small plot of English earth contain everything that Winston Churchill was? The answer, of course, is that it cannot. The stone marks where his body lies, but his legacy extends far beyond anything that could be contained in a churchyard. It extends to the freedom of nations that might have fallen to tyranny. It extends to the words that are still quoted and the speeches that are still remembered. It extends to the debates that are still conducted, more than 50 years after his death, about what he did and what he failed to do, what he achieved and what he left undone. The question of what Winston Churchill meant, what his life represented, what his legacy would be, was just beginning to be asked on the day of his funeral. In the years and decades that followed, the answers would prove far more complicated than the pageantry of that January day had suggested. The simplest answer, the one that justified the state funeral and the bowing cranes and the tears of veterans, was that he had saved Western civilization. In May of 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, when the forces of tyranny seemed unstoppable, when every rational calculation suggested that accommodation was the only sensible course, Winston Churchill had refused to yield. His stubbornness, his eloquence, his absolute conviction that surrender was worse than death, these had held the line until allies could be found and victory achieved. Without Churchill, Britain might have negotiated with Hitler in the summer of 1940. The terms would have been humiliating but survivable: a puppet government, a dismantled empire, a Britain reduced to German satellite. From Hitler's perspective, such an arrangement would have been ideal. It would have freed him to concentrate all his forces against the Soviet Union, without the distraction of a Western front or the threat of British-based bombing campaigns. The world that emerged from such a settlement would have been unrecognizably darker than the one we inhabit. This did not happen. Churchill prevented it. Through sheer force of will, through the power of his words, through his refusal to accept what everyone else considered inevitable, he kept Britain in the war until the tide could turn. That alone would justify every honor heaped upon his grave. But history is never simple, and Churchill was never a simple man. The same qualities that made him invaluable in wartime made him dangerous in peace. The same stubbornness that refused to surrender to Hitler also refused to acknowledge the legitimate aspirations of colonized peoples. The same worldview that enabled him to recognize Nazi evil blinded him to the evils perpetrated in the name of empire. The same rhetoric that inspired millions of Britons dismissed millions of Indians as a beastly people with a beastly religion. The Bengal famine remained, a shadow across his legacy that no amount of wartime heroism could dispel. 3 million people had died in 1943, while Churchill asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet. No rationalization could excuse his indifference to mass death among people he considered racially inferior. The food existed. The ships existed. The administrative capacity to organize relief existed. What was lacking was the will to save brown lives with the same urgency that would have been applied to saving white ones. His views on race were not incidental to his character. They were central to it. He believed in hierarchy, racial, social, civilizational, with a conviction that never wavered from his youth to his death. He believed that some peoples were destined to rule and others to be ruled, that the British Empire was a force for progress in the world, that the higher races had not merely the right but the duty to govern the lower ones. These beliefs shaped his policies, his priorities, his understanding of who mattered and who could be sacrificed. They explain Bengal. They explain his resistance to Indian independence. They explain his attitudes toward the Middle East and Africa and every other part of the world where white Europeans ruled over non-white peoples. Leo Amory, his own colleague in the War Cabinet, had compared his views on India to Hitler's. The comparison was not entirely fair. Churchill did not build death camps or pursue systematic genocide, but it captured something true about the limits of his moral imagination. He could see evil clearly when it threatened people who looked like him. He could not see it, or would not see it, when it was inflicted by people who looked like him on people who did not. His family had paid a price for his greatness, a price that would continue to be paid long after he was gone. Diana, the eldest, dead by her own hand at 54, the black dog that Winston had named and fought claiming another victim in the next generation. Randolph, the only son, dead at 57 from a lifetime of alcohol abuse, his potential squandered, his biography of his father left unfinished, his relationship with Winston a wound that never healed. Sarah, arrested and humiliated, her talent wasted, her life a long struggle with addiction and disappointment. Even Mary, the successful one, had organized her entire existence around protecting her father's legacy, sacrificing her own ambitions to serve his memory. Clementine had paid too, perhaps more than anyone. She had subordinated her own needs to his for 57 years. She had managed his moods, the black dog depressions, the manic enthusiasms, the rages and the sulks. She had covered for his excesses, the drinking, the spending, the chronic inability to live within any budget. She had maintained the facade of a functional household while chaos swirled around her, while creditors threatened and children struggled, and her own health deteriorated under the strain. She had watched him lavish attention on his political career while their children begged for scraps of his affection. She had accepted that she would always be second to his ambition, that his need for power and glory and the roar of the crowd would always outweigh his need for her. She had stayed, and she had survived, and she had loved him despite everything. But the cost was etched into every line of her face, visible to anyone who looked closely enough to see it. He was a great man. This is beyond dispute. He possessed gifts of leadership, of rhetoric, of strategic vision that appear perhaps once in a century. He rose to meet a moment of supreme crisis and met it supremely. He articulated the values of Western civilization at the moment when those values most needed articulating. He gave courage to millions who had none of their own. The world is better because he lived. He was also a deeply flawed man. He held views that were repugnant even by the standards of his time. He made decisions that cost millions of lives, not only among enemies, but among subjects of the empire he claimed to serve. He neglected his family, indulged his appetites, and displayed a capacity for cruelty that sat uneasily beside his famous magnanimity. Both of these things are true. The past does not require us to choose between them. It requires us only to see clearly, to weigh the evidence honestly, to resist the temptation to simplify what cannot be simplified. Winston Churchill was born in a palace and died in a townhouse. He began life as the disappointing son of a dying aristocrat and ended it as the most celebrated Englishman since Shakespeare. He fought in cavalry charges with sabers and lances, and lived to see men walk on the moon. He knew Queen Victoria when he was a young officer and President Kennedy when he was an old man. He spanned worlds, eras, transformations that would have overwhelmed most people. He fought the black dog all his life and he won, or at least he fought it to a draw. He never surrendered to the shadow within, just as he never surrendered to the enemies without. He kept painting, kept writing, kept struggling forward when every rational calculation suggested he should give up. This too was part of his greatness, the refusal to be defeated by enemies or by himself. On his 80th birthday, when asked about facing death, he had offered one last flash of the wit that had defined him. "I am ready to meet my Maker. Whether my Maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." The cranes dipped their jibs as his coffin passed on the Havengor. The workers saluted the aristocrat who had asked them to bleed and die for a country that had not always treated them fairly. Perhaps they understood something that his critics sometimes miss, that gratitude and criticism are not mutually exclusive, that you can honor someone for what they gave while mourning what they took, that the measure of a life is not its purity but its weight. Winston Churchill's life weighed heavily on the scales of time. It still does. It always will. He rests now at Bladon, beside his parents and near the palace where he was born 90 years before. The visitors come to see his grave, to pay their respects or satisfy their curiosity or simply to stand for a moment in the presence of the past. The stone is simple. The inscription is plain. There is nothing there to suggest the magnitude of the life it marks. But then how could there be? How could any stone capture the sweep of 90 years, the triumphs and disasters, the words that rallied nations and the silences that condemned millions? How could any monument contain the whole contradictory truth of a man who was both lion and shadow, hero and villain, savior and scourge? It cannot. We are left with the questions, the debates, the unresolved tensions that make the past worth examining and heroes worth scrutinizing. We are left with the recognition that greatness is not the same as goodness, that the people who change the world are not always the people we would want as neighbors or friends. Winston Churchill changed the world. He saved it from one horror while perpetuating others. He inspired millions while failing the people closest to him. He spoke for freedom while denying it to those he deemed unworthy. He was, in short, a human being, larger than most, more consequential than almost any, but human nonetheless. This was the story of Winston Churchill, not the bronze statue in Parliament Square, standing eternal guard over the democracy he preserved, not the face on the 5-pound note, reduced to a symbol shorn of complexity, not the legend polished smooth by decades of reverence and selective memory. This was the man, the boy who begged his mother to visit and learned that love could not be commanded, the soldier who rode toward death because he could not bear to live with himself as a coward, the politician who crossed every line and burned every bridge in pursuit of power, the husband who loved imperfectly but never stopped loving, the father who failed his children in ways they would spend their lives trying to understand, the leader who saved a civilization while letting millions starve. He contained multitudes. He defied simple judgment. He was, in the end, magnificently and terribly human. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is everything. Thank you for watching.